Welcome back to the final part of Chapter 7, our discussion of South and East Asia. In this last part 3, we're going to talk about some geopolitical issues in the region, as well as economics. And so there are a lot of territorial disputes that are happening in the region, particularly with concerns to China's claims over the South China Sea, which can be seen over here. The red line is the area that China claims. The blue lines represent what other countries claim based upon the UN's law of the sea, and China is actually kind of building up islands out there in the Spratly Islands. You're going to watch a video about that after you watch this this part of the lecture. There's also some Islamist separatist movements in the region, and like so many other regions that we talked about, this nationalism is on the rise, right? So people being concerned with people in their country being of the same kind of ethnicity or religion. We can also see here the demilitarized zone, which is that border between North and South Korea. North Korea has certainly been in the news for us a lot lately. And there are also several communist regimes in the region, not just China, but also Vietnam and Laos. In addition, we have the presence of nuclear weapons in the region, which can make things very tense, particularly with concerns recently, again, to North Korea, who's been kind of having a little back and forth in the news with our administration. We certainly see the effects of colonialism in the region. So most European colonies were in the south and the southeast. There was more effective resistance in this region than in Africa and Latin America, especially with concerns to China, Korea, and Japan. Siam, which is the former name of Thailand, were able to maintain their independence. There are no colonies there today, but those cultural and economic legacies remain, especially with concerns to language. We think about English being spoken in India, religion with concerns to Christianity being in the Philippines. Food, up at top there is a picture of a banh mi sandwich, which if you haven't tried one, I encourage you to. It's this delicious Vietnamese sandwich, but it's this kind of very Vietnamese flavored food on this crusty French baguette, which Vietnam was a former French colony. Many governments have very kind of European styles of governments, as well as similar agricultural patterns. And so we have some similar problems that we saw in the Middle East with concerns to borders and separating groups of people, particularly with something called the Partition of India. So South Asia was one gigantic British colony, and in 1948, when they gained independence, they were split into Hindu and Muslim states. But the question is, where do you draw that boundary? Because it's not like people are just living in clear regions. So you have the region of Kashmir, which the Muslim area was given to India, but there's been constant fighting there ever since. And so you get also these like very complicated borders. If you zoom in on the border between Pakistan and India in some regions, you have just these insane borders where people's property were basically they were trying to have certain people's property in certain countries, and so it's just a very complicated border. We also have religious tensions in India. They have a history of sectarian violence there, including Sikh separatist movement in Punjab, the assassination of Indira Gandhi. We have some violence that happened with riots in 2002, the Mumbai attacks by Pakistani militants in 2008. There are some shifting politics in the region. There's a new Prime Minister, Modi. He's a Hindu nationalist. Again, those nationalist movements are on the rise. In Afghanistan, which some books will put this as part of the Middle East. Your book puts it as part of South and East Asia, but it is literally between the Middle East and South Asia, literally and figuratively. It's been politically unstable since the Soviet invasion in 1979, and so often, we've been in a conflict with Afghanistan for quite some time now, and often when we think about kind of what regions the Afghani government is able to control, it's really just the regions like right around the capital. Many other parts of the country are kind of controlled by a variety of other groups. Lots of ethnic tension in the region, although not from a European creation. Um, it is mountainous, it is rural, it is agricultural, and it is landlocked. And their best crop right now is opium poppy, which a lot of people don't want to grow opium, but they are able to make the best living doing that. It's really hard to grow food in the region due to it being this mountainous region, which a lot of it also does not get very much precipitation. And the Taliban and Islamism are still really highly influential in Afghanistan. Next, we're going to talk about this idea of Chinese expansionism, which again, we can think of it too, kind of some parallels between what we talked about, the expansion of Russia, except now we're going to talk about the expansion of China. So much like Russification we had in Russia, we have Hanification in China, and that's the Dominics of this Han ethnic group. And kind of spreading that culture, very similar to Russification. We do have some autonomous ethnic regions, including Inner Mongolia and Tibet. And so if you can see, like, there's frontier China, which is out here, and then there's kind of China proper, which is what we often think of when we think of China. So these autonomous regions that are kind of operating in the northern and western periphery that are not part of that Han Dominic ethnic group. And so you can get a lot of unrest and terrorism and separatism in these areas. A lot of people, you'll see a lot of movements to free Tibet from Chinese rule. And then we have Taiwan. Taiwan is de facto independent, and what I mean by de facto is that it essentially operates as its own country. It has operated that way since the Chinese Communist Revolution in 1949, but it is claimed by the People's Republic of China. And so if you look at a map of China, Taiwan is claimed as part of China. Its independence is unrecognized by most other countries, which is pretty unique because any recognition of Taiwan as an independent country, China would cease trade. So while the U.S. Recognizes that Taiwan de facto operates as its own country, we do business with Taiwan all the time, we do not recognize it as an independent country from China. When our current president took office and talked to the president of Taiwan, it was a big deal because U.S. presidents before had not done that. Then we have North Korea in the region, which is its own unique place. It has been communist since shortly after World War II, and it has this Stalinist-style autocracy where the leader is the supreme leader of the country, and that rule is law. There is no dissent in North Korea. They've had a lot of problems with famine, the suppression of information. A lot of people try to smuggle USB drives into the country just to give people a glimpse of the outside world. It is heavy militaristic, right? Much of the country's resources are just invested into the military. And there is this idea of juche, or self-reliance, where everyone else is evil outside of North Korea, especially the United States, But you can see how underdeveloped the country is. So here is South Korea at night. Here is North Korea at night, right? Not very much power. And you can see here is a picture in Pyongyang where nobody has power at night except the lighting of the picture of the leader, right? And so there's just this cult of personality for the Kim family. He's kind of this mythic person who is kind of all-knowing and all-ruling. Lastly, we're going to talk about the economy of the region. So we have some extremely poor and pre-industrial countries like Laos, Timor-Leste, and Afghanistan. And we have some rich post-industrial countries like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. Most are somewhere in between. They're in the process of industrializing with important agricultural components still happening. So we can see, the difference here, like a tea plantation in Malaysia versus Taipei 101, which is this huge tower in Taiwan. And so this includes China and India. China and India are these massive emerging economies, still have a lot of agriculture happening there, still have a lot of poverty, but they are building these kind of mega cities and kind of transitioning into that industrial sector. And so when we also think about economic development in the area, there have been waves of economic growth in in East Asia, that have hit varying countries at varying times in history. And so in the earliest 20th century, right after World War II, it was Japan. And then after that, in the 60s to the 90s, it was these countries called the Four Tigers, whose economies grew rapidly. And that was Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, who are now in this post-industrial economy. And so where do we see the most growth now? Who are the next tigers of the region? So China has the most growth. Literally everything is made here. Actually, I don't mean literally, I mean figuratively, but a lot of our stuff is made there. We purchase a lot of things from Taiwan. They have state-run capitalism, so it's a capitalist economy, but it's completely controlled by the government. China very much tried to learn the lessons of the USSR and not to have their regime collapse due to this economic instability. So instead, they opened themselves up to capitalism. And they've had an extraordinarily rapid growth. For a while, it was 10% per year, which is extremely large. It has slowed down recently, and they're trying to adjust to that from that boom that happened for a while. It's made possible by, one, cheap labor. You have lots of people moving in from rural areas with large population coming in to work at these jobs, which has had all types of cultural effects as well. China has built the infrastructure in order to have this. When you have a communist regime who can kind of do what they want, you can build cities pretty darn fast. They also created these special economic zones. And so when Mao's communism was failing in the 1980s, basically they created these special economic zones. Shenzhen was the first one, which were open to foreign investment. And now they've created more. They relaxed trade regulations. They went from this very insular economy and just opened it up to the world. And this basic concept has spread to the rest of the country. And so it's mostly coastal. You see here, if you look at the GDP per person per province, right, most of the money is being made on the coast, where goods can be easily exported, but it is starting to filter through to other provinces as well. And so who are the new tigers in South and East Asia? Malaysia, which is doing a lot of high-tech manufacturing, and is increasingly getting post-industrial. Low-tech elsewhere, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand. If you want to think about where your clothes are, if you look at your clothing tags right now, there is a good chance that something you are wearing was made in Vietnam, Cambodia, or Thailand. Which has led to a bunch of other problems, and I'll talk about that. In Bangladesh, we have very, very cheap labor and this kind of low-tech manufacturing growth. But the minimum wage in a garment factory is 2,850 taka a month, or about $34 a month. So again, that really cheap clothing that we're able to buy in the United States is because we're paying people very little to make it in these countries. And there's also little oversight or regulation of the industry. This is a garment factory collapse that happened in Dhaka in 2013, where over 1,100 people died. And generally speaking, what happens with these supply chains is that you buy your clothes from the Gap or H&M or for somebody else who will have their own standards of how clothing is supposed to be made and what worker conditions are supposed to be. And they may have inspected one factory where their clothing is being made, but then due to these complicated supply chains, people will subcontract out a variety of things to a variety of other places that may not have been inspected. So very often there's just very little oversight that's happening. When we think about the Indian economy, it is more of a free market than China. Again, they have a democracy, but they have massive corruption and a huge bureaucracy at the same time. Lots of foreign investment happening in India. You can see here's a picture of a call center. There's a good chance that if you call to talk to somebody about your credit card or your internet or something like that, that you're actually talking to somebody in India. Also, lots of manufacturing that's happening there. That outsourcing of jobs again, which has been a huge contention in the American economy. Lots of inequality though. So we can see down here is a picture of a slum, and here is a picture of some very expensive high-rises that are being built. So there are a few people that are very rich. Most people in the country are still very, very poor. But they do have a growing middle class of about 300 million. And so one of the signs of a very strong economy is a growing middle class. And so again, on the left here, we have a $1 billion house in Mumbai, and at the top we have an Indian call center, and at the bottom an outdoor laundry that's in a slum in Mumbai. So all of these things existing in that same space. All of this growth has brought environmental problems, many that we went through in the United States quite some time ago. Lots with air pollution. Here is Beijing, which has had horrible problems with air pollution. When the Olympics were in Beijing, they closed a bunch of the coal-fired power plants, at least temporarily, got rid of a bunch of the automobile traffic, and the air quality went from this to this. And they did that because they were worried about people coming to Beijing, and then also athletes having to run in Beijing and it not being very effective for them. Also, rising sea levels. Here's a picture of the Maldives. You have a lot of island nations that are basically at sea level. They held an underwater cabinet meeting to kind of make a statement about climate change and the effects that climate change is happening on their countries. It's really these countries that are going to be kind of at the forefront of who is hurt first by climate change. We also have problems with widespread deforestation for resource use. This is happening also in China, and more consumers, right? So generally speaking, as you have this growing middle class, they are buying more things and they are using more resources and getting to more of kind of a US or a Western based level of consumption. We also have our less developed economies in Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, Timor-Leste, and Afghanistan. Lots of subsistence agriculture still happening there, so people just growing food for themselves and their families. Unstable governance, recent violence, and instability makes this growth difficult. And we'll talk a little about the difference between Myanmar and Thailand and why Thailand has been able to grow so much and Myanmar has not. So, the question is like, who is going to be the next to developed? Where will your pants be made in 2030? Because that wave is probably going to leave some of these countries and hit other ones as they enter into these post-industrial economies. And so the last thing that I wanted to talk about in this lecture was kind of migration based upon economics. So if you think about two countries here, Thailand and Burma, which is officially called Myanmar, but has historically been called Burma. Thailand has a population of 67 million, only 8% live below the poverty line, a pretty high GDP per capita. They have an export-based economy, so they grow a lot of things. Make a lot of things that they export. And they also have labor shortages there. They don't have enough people to work. You look at a place like Burma, who's got a population of 53 million, rather than 8% living below the poverty line, they have a third living below the poverty line, a much lower GDP, and they have this very traditionally insular economy. It's changing a little bit, but they also have this kind of very ineffective leadership. And so migration is going from Burma to Thailand, but there are all kinds of problems that can happen with that, where lots of instances of slavery happening with the Thai fishing industry, where you have people coming from Burma who are basically their papers are confiscated once they get into the country, or they don't realize that they're going to the country illegally, and they basically become indentured servants. And so there's been all these exposés done about these men who are basically forced into slavery. They live on these Thai fishing boats. They're treated very poorly. They're not paid. They're not even really allowed off the fishing boat. And you're going to watch a particular video after this that The Guardian did about the Rohingya, who have also been the subject of ethnic cleansing in Myanmar currently in the news right now, and about the Rohingya having even less rights once they get to Thailand. So that is the end of our lecture for Chapter 7. So after this, you'll complete your next exercise, do your country journal for the week. Next week, in the next module, we have I believe you're having your second exam, and you'll be starting Sub-Saharan Africa.